Okay, how does this happen? How can a man who literally builds a new nation from the ground up end up leading a doomed rebellion against his own creation? I mean, this isn't just some hypothetical. It's the real, searing paradox at the heart of the life of Saigō Takamori, one of the most important and, frankly, most misunderstood figures in all of Japanese history. So let's really get into this, because his story, it's not just about one man. It's the story of modern Japan's turbulent, violent, and incredibly contradictory birth. It's a story of progress and tradition locked in this brutal death grip with one man caught right in the middle.
So, before he was ever labeled a rebel, Saigō Takamori was the establishment. The slide here calls him the architect of modern Japan, and this image tells you everything you need to know. That's not the outfit of a revolutionary, right? That's the uniform of a field marshal in the brand new Imperial Japanese Army, an army he helped create from scratch. He was one of the three great nobles of the Meiji Restoration, a leader who was absolutely pivotal in overthrowing the centuries-old shogunate and putting power back in the hands of the emperor. He wasn't just part of the new government. In so many ways, he was its heart, its conscience, and for sure, its sword.
And what he accomplished was just monumental. As a commander, he led the Imperial forces to victory in the Boshin War, which sealed the deal for the Restoration. But maybe his greatest achievement wasn't even on the battlefield. Think about this. In 1868, his armies are at the gates of Edo, the shogun's capital, a city with over 1 million people. A battle would have been an absolute bloodbath. But instead, Saigō negotiated the peaceful surrender of the city. It was this incredible moment of pragmatism and humanity that literally saved the new nation from a catastrophic civil war right at its own birth. He chose unity over revenge.
All right, so to really understand how this hero became a rebel, we're going to trace his whole tragic story. First up, we'll look at his incredible role as an architect of a new Japan. Then we'll get to the breaking point, that huge clash of ideas that pushed him out of power. We'll see how he got pulled into what was really a reluctant rebellion. And then we'll witness his final, hopeless fight, a 60-to-1 last stand. After that, we're going to uncover the truth about the death of a samurai, because that story is not what you think it is. And finally, we'll explore the birth of a legend and how Japan managed to turn its greatest rebel into one of its most beloved heroes.
So, let's start at the beginning. Saigō wasn't born into some powerful elite family. Nope. He came from a pretty low-ranking samurai family way down in the Satsuma domain, on the southern tip of Japan. But through just sheer force of will, his incredible intellect, and this unwavering belief in his principles, he rose up to become a key advisor to his lord. He was a big guy, nearly 6 feet tall and built like a bear, but everyone knew him for his quiet sincerity and his absolute integrity. He was a modernizer, a reformer. He was a man who knew Japan had to change if it was going to survive in this new world that was suddenly and very violently knocking on its door.
This timeline really shows you how methodically Saigō just dismantled the old world to build a new one. In 1866, he creates the Satsho Alliance, this secret pact between his own domain and their bitter rivals. I mean, this was politically unthinkable, but it created the engine that drove the revolution. But look at 1871. This part is absolutely crucial. He's a key player in abolishing the Han system, the feudal domains themselves. Just try to imagine the scale of this. He's basically voting his own power base, his own home turf out of existence for the good of the entire nation. This wasn't a man clinging to the past. This was a true nation builder at work.
And this, right here, brings us to the core of the tragedy. If Saigō was so essential in creating the new Meiji government, why on earth did he turn against it? Well, the answer is all about the dizzying speed of the changes. For over 200 years, Japan had been almost completely closed off. Then, in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry shows up with his steam-powered black ships and basically forces Japan open for business. That event just shattered the nation's confidence. Japan saw what was happening to China next door, being carved up by Western powers. The elite knew they had a choice: modernize fast or get colonized. Saigō wanted a strong, modern Japan, for sure, but one that still honored its warrior class. The government he helped create? They saw that warrior class as the very thing holding Japan back. This slide just illustrates the collision course perfectly. On one side, you have the entire social structure of the samurai, their status, their right to wear 2 swords, their government income, their whole way of life. And on the other side, you have the Meiji reforms, which just systematically took a wrecking ball to that world. The samurai class itself, abolished. The right to wear swords, banned. A new national army was created by drafting commoners, farmers and merchants fighting next to warriors, a concept that was just totally alien to the samurai identity. And finally, their income was converted into government bonds, which basically bankrupted many of them. To the government, this was necessary progress. To the samurai, it felt like a profound betrayal.
The final straw was this political crisis known as Seiken-ran. So when Korea refused to recognize the new Japanese government, Saigō argued for a really aggressive stance. And his proposal was, well, it was extraordinary. He suggested that he himself would go to Korea as an envoy, act provocatively, and get himself assassinated. His death would then give Japan the perfect excuse to invade. Now, his thinking here was complex. Yeah, it was partly about showing Japan's new strength, but it was also a way to give thousands of now unemployed, angry samurai a new purpose, a glorious war to fight and die for. But the other leaders, who had just gotten back from a trip to the West, wanted to focus on internal development. They said no.
His departure from the government wasn't a quiet exit, it was an earthquake. When his plan was rejected, Saigō didn't just retire, he resigned from every single one of his powerful positions. And as this quote says, he didn't leave alone. Hundreds of high-ranking military officers and officials, mostly from his home turf, resigned in protest and followed him home to Kagoshima. It was like a government in exile had just been created overnight. The central government had lost its most charismatic leader, and in doing so had created a powerful symbol for everyone who was against its radical new direction.
But here's the thing. Saigō didn't go home to start a rebellion. He really just wanted to retire, to go hunting and fishing. But his fame, his immense prestige, it made him a magnet for every samurai who felt betrayed by this new era. So in Kagoshima, he set up these private schools, or shigakko, to give these angry young men a purpose, an education in traditional samurai values. He was teaching them military tactics, Confucian ethics, and he was creating a generation that was fiercely loyal to him, personally. He didn't know it at the time, but he was building the army that would fight Japan's very last civil war.
You can almost see the dominoes falling here, one by one. Step 1. The schools he founded to help people become this sort of mini-government in his home province, fostering this intense loyalty to him, not to Tokyo. Step 2. The central government, watching all this with growing panic, makes a huge mistake. They sent ships to secretly remove weapons from the local arsenal. Step 3. At the exact same time, a government spy is caught and confesses to a plot to assassinate Saigō. For these hot-headed students, this is the ultimate betrayal. They raid the arsenal themselves. Saigō is horrified by this, but he feels his honor is tied to his followers. And so, in the final step, he reluctantly agrees to lead them, not to overthrow the emperor, but to march on Tokyo and demand answers from the very government he felt had lost its way.
From the very start, the rebellion was doomed. After a few early wins, Saigō's traditional samurai army was just systematically ground down by the modern, well-supplied imperial military. What started with nearly 30,000 men ended after 7 brutal months of fighting and retreating with just a few hundred left. They returned to their home city of Kagoshima and made their final stand on a small hill called Shiroyama. The odds they were facing weren't just long, they were completely impossible.
So, the imperial government sent an army of 30,000 soldiers to crush the rebellion once and for all. This was a modern force, conscripts armed with modern rifles, backed by heavy artillery. And in a final tragic twist, they were commanded by General Yamagata Aritomo, a man who had fought right alongside Saigō during the Meiji Restoration. Now, old friends were tasked with destroying each other. The new Japan was about to eat one of its own founding fathers.
And who was this massive army facing? Just 500 samurai. That was all that was left. They were exhausted, sick, wounded, and had almost no ammunition or food. Many of them were armed with little more than their swords. But their fighting spirit, rooted in the samurai code, was unbroken. They knew this was it. This was their last battle, and they were determined to die with honor for the man they loved.
The government was not taking any chances. For days before the final assault, they just pounded the small hill of Shiroyama with a relentless artillery barrage. Over 7,000 shells rained down on the samurai. It was the brutal, impersonal warfare of the new world, being unleashed on the warriors of the old. The stone walls around that area still have the scars from bullets and shells today, a physical reminder of just how ferocious this was.
Their position was completely hopeless. General Yamagata built this complex system of trenches and earthworks, totally encircling the hill. Warships in the bay added their cannons to the bombardment and cut off any chance of escape by sea. Saigō and his men were trapped in an iron cage, being patiently starved and shelled, with no way out but death.
So on the morning of September 24th, 1877, the final assault began. At dawn, what was left of the samurai charged downhill right into the teeth of the Imperial lines. What happened in those last few moments would define Saigō's legacy forever. But the popular story, the one you see in movies and read in books, it's almost certainly a myth. We're about to tear down that legend and find the truth.
This is the story everyone knows. In the heat of the final battle, a wounded Saigō calmly finds a spot, bows towards the Imperial Palace in a final act of loyalty, and commits seppuku. This ritual suicide was the ultimate samurai way to preserve your honor in death. His loyal follower, Beppu Shinsuke, then performs the duty of the kaishakunin, beheading him to end his suffering. It's the perfect, honorable, romantic death for the last true samurai.
It's a perfect ending. The only problem is, it almost certainly didn't happen that way. The historical evidence paints a very different and much grimmer picture. You see, the romantic legend of his death started to form right away, but it only became the standard account decades later as Japan was building up its modern nationalist identity. The country needed heroes, and a perfect honorable death was a lot more useful than a messy, tragic one.
Okay, so this is where the legend crashes into the facts. Let's break it down. The legend says ritual suicide. But the autopsy report, which was done right after the battle, says he was severely wounded by a bullet in his hip and abdomen. And crucially, there were no cuts on his stomach that would indicate seppuku. The expert analysis from historian Mark Ravenna concludes that those gunshot wounds would have been so crippling that performing the calm, complex ritual would have been physically impossible. So what most likely happened? Saigō was mortally wounded by gunfire, and his follower beheaded him simply to prevent his leader from being captured alive. A final act of loyalty, yes, but not the romantic suicide of the legend.
So Saigō's death ended the rebellion and cemented the power of the new government. He died a traitor to the state. His head was even put on display for a short time. And yet, this is where the most amazing part of his story actually begins. In death, Saigō Takamori became more powerful and more revered than he ever was in life. Japan took its defeated rebel and turned him into a national hero. These two images just capture that transformation perfectly. On the left, you see the man, the formal, official portrait of a government leader. But on the right, you see the myth, a dramatic, action-packed print of a heroic warrior. This is how the public chose to remember him. And why? Well, because as Japan was rocketing towards modernization with its trains and factories and Western clothes, people got anxious about what they were losing. Saigō became the symbol of that loss, the embodiment of pure samurai virtue and sincerity in what many people feared was becoming a soulless age. He represented an authentic Japanese spirit they felt was being erased.
And this happened incredibly quickly. Public sympathy for Saigō was immediate and overwhelming. All these wild legends started spreading. Some people said he hadn't died at all, but had escaped to Russia to plan his return, or that he'd even ascended to the planet Mars, where he was watching over Japan. And then, in this just stunning official reversal, Emperor Meiji himself posthumously pardoned Saigō in 1889, restoring all his old ranks. A statue of him went up in Tokyo. The rehabilitation was complete. Saigō the rebel was gone, replaced by Saigō the national symbol, the last true samurai, a figure of pure, tragic heroism.
And so we end right back where we started, with a paradox. Saigō Takamori fought and died against the modern Japanese state, and yet he became one of its most important heroes. His story forces us to ask a really fundamental question. When a nation chooses to celebrate a man who fought against its own progress, what does that reveal about its soul? It seems to suggest this deep tension between the future a country has to build and the past it just can't bear to forget. What does it tell us about the enduring power of tradition and honor and the pull of a romantic past even when you're staring down an inevitable future?